Welcome back to another introduction to insect taxonomy and identification. Today we're going to be going over the termites, which if you watched the last section on the roaches, the Blattodea, once upon a time these were considered separate groups, but nowadays the Isoptera and the Blattodea, the Isoptera being the termites, are considered a subgroup of the roaches. And this is largely because of behavioral and morphological characteristics and then some genetic work and things like that. But the Isoptera seem to be roaches which evolved to be more social and care for their young and form colonies and then to eat wood as well. And there are some roaches which are kind of an intermediate stage which are subsocial and can also digest wood. So things that we've already covered, we've covered the Entonatha, we've covered the primitive wingless insects, and then now we're still talking about hemimetabolous insects. These are insects which do not do not undergo a full metamorphosis. The immatures basically just look like the adults without wings. We talked about the Paleoptera, which are the primitive flying insects which cannot fold their wings fully over the back of their body. These were the mayflies, the dragonflies, and the damselflies. And now we're talking about the Neoptera, which are insects which can fold their wings fully behind them, even though we're still talking about the hemimetabolous Neoptera. So we talked about the stoneflies, we talked about the roaches, and now we're going to talk about a subgroup of the roaches, the Isoptera, which are the termites. So if you will remember from the Blattodea, which are the roaches, there were three major subfamilies that we were talking about, and the Blattodea. Off the Blattodea here, you have the evolution of the termites, and this was the cryptocercid roaches, were the roaches which were subsocial. They cared for their young, and they could eat and digest wood, and that is through the use of bacterial and protist symbiotes in the digestive tract, which eat the wood for them, and they get the energy from it. So if we look at the Isoptera, or what is sometimes called the epifamily Termitoidae, this is a cluster within the Blattodea, within the roaches. They used to be called Isoptera, which means same wing, because the adults have kind of identical wings, and we will talk about that in a minute. Or equal wing is what it means. So there are a number of groups, a number of families within the termites. We're not going to talk about all of them because not all of them are present in North America. For instance, the Mastotermitidae are not present. These aren't here, so we don't need to talk about those. And then there are a couple of families which I didn't even bother listing because they're only present in the tropics for the most part. And termites are overwhelmingly tropical. By mass, they're probably the most abundant thing in a jungle ecosystem. But in the US and Canada, we're really interested in the Kalotermitidae and the Heterotermitidae, which used to be called the Rhinotermitidae, if you're familiar. And then we have a few Termitidae, the higher termites, which are present in the desert southwest. And then there's the Archotermopsidae, which there's, I believe, only one genus which is present in the entirety of North America, north of Mexico. Anyway, so all of these are subsets of roaches. There are approximately 4 families, like I said, and 44 species in North America, although worldwide there are 7 families and over 3,000 species of termites, so lots and lots of species on top of the roaches we talked about last time. Termites are the only hemimetabolous insect which exhibit true social behavior. And when we talk about sociality in insects, or what is sometimes called eusociality, true sociality, which is EU is a prefix for true, there are it is a categorical definition that requires the insect to meet certain criteria. So there has to be a division of labor amongst the insects, which form the colony. So different individuals have to be fulfilling different roles, or fulfill different roles over the course of their life. So foraging or defense, or taking care of the nest, things like that. There's cooperative brood care. So the whole colony has to care for all of the brood, even the brood of other females. And in the case of like the Isoptera, the brood of the queen. So it's not like individual females are caring for their individual children. There have to be overlapping generations. So the adults within the colony have to be emerging, overlapping with other adults. So in a lot of insects, there'll just be like one point of laying eggs in the spring. All of the insects will emerge at once. The old adults will all die off, and then you'll have a new generation of adults. So you see this with things like caterpillars into butterflies, and a lot of beetles do this. So there has to be a constant overlap. So like with bees and termites, the queen is constantly laying eggs. And so all of the workers within the hive are of different ages. So there has to be that overlap. And generally there is a caste structure. So there'll be a single or a handful of reproductives. In the case of termites, there is a king and queen. And as the colony expands, sometimes you'll get more than one king and queen, or the old queen will die off and a new queen will be raised up, or a new king will be raised up to mate with the queen. With like honeybees, there's only one queen and there is no king. But there's also like the soldiers or the workers or the drones, things like that. So this is the only hemimetabolous insect that is actually truly eusocial. There are, like I said, there are roaches which are kind of considered subsocial because they do have semi-colonial sort of structure where they kind of all hang out together, and the adults do care for the young, but you don't have all of these characteristics. So that is kind of interesting. One other thing to talk about is the kind of complicated life cycle of a termite colony before we move on from the social structure. So eggs are laid. So this over here, this side over here, you can just ignore. This is just for ants, which we'll talk about when we get to the ants. But the termites have a different sort of structure. They all have diploid eggs, which means they have, like humans, they have two sets of all the chromosomes. And those eggs will hatch into either male or female, unlike honeybees, where all of the workers are female and the males become drones. In termites, it can be male or female. Either these will become reproductives, which are the kings and queens, and it's only the kings and queens which develop wings, and the wings are only held on them temporarily. The wings are only on them during their swarming season, so this can be in the spring or the fall, depending on the species. And generally, after you have a good rain, a colony will produce a ton of these alate or winged adults, and they're either males or females, and they will fly off and mate and then start new colonies. And then when the colonies start, the wings fall off. And the reason that those wings fall off is so that the female has more energy for laying eggs. She'll dispose of her wings, and then she digests her own wing muscles for more calories because laying eggs is a lot of work. And then there's the wingless line, the apterous line. Apterous is without wings. And these are the workers and the soldiers. And a number of different workers and soldiers can be grown. So, some are called major, some are called minor, and that is depending on the size of the worker. So not all of the workers are the same size. And then you end up with the soldier class, which are generally much larger than the workers. And the kings and queens are also very large, but the soldiers are also very large, much larger. They have much larger heads, much larger mandibles. Sometimes they have something called an assuti, which is like a defensive structure on the head that we'll talk about in a bit. And that is how all of the castes are established. But they all are established from the same egg. And this is different from honeybees, which in honeybee colonies, the male is haploid, so he only has one set of genes, and the females are diploid. The workers are diploid, and the queens are diploid. They have two sets of genes. So it does work differently. The social structure and the genetic structure does work differently in the termites. So let's talk a bit about the termites again in general, not the social structure, but their physical appearance. So let's discuss some of the physical appearances of the termites. This is a Formosan termite. And these are what the adult alate winged termites look like. So this, when we're talking about Isoptera, the identical wings or equal wings, you can see here their wings are identical shape, both the forewing and the hind wing. These are the wings that fall off. The adult king and queen tend to be much darker. than the rest of the colony, and they are much larger than the rest of the colony. Frequently in swarm season, you'll see these all over the place. And then after they disappear, you'll see their wings all over the place. They kind of blow in the wind if you're in an area with very high termite counts. Then if you look at something like the workers and soldiers, these are the Archotermopsidae. The soldiers tend to have white bodies and very, very large heads, and they're much larger than the workers, which are just a kind of white or cream colored body, smaller heads, and then there are major and minor workers, so they'll be different sizes. But generally speaking, you can identify the soldier very quickly by their enormous head, enormous jaws, or an enormous nasuti, which we will talk about in a minute. They're just much, much larger in general. Termites in general tend to be kind of broadly joined together, meaning that you don't have a waist like you would see in an ant. It's kind of a pudgier, stouter body, and they tend to be very, very soft, unlike ants, which tend to be heavily sclerotized, heavily armored. So it's an easy ID to make in between like an ant versus a termite. If you were digging in your yard and you saw a bunch of little insects come swarming out, if they're white and they look soft, it's termite. Workers and adults really both have these long filiform or maniliform antennae, kind of like a chain of beads, which are the same across all the termites. They have large mandibles for chewing on all castes, and their eyes may be present or absent depending on the genus. They may have eyes. They may or may not have ocelli, which are those simple eyes on top of some insects' heads. And then other differences will be sort of family specific. So moving on to the families, this is Archotermopsid. This is Archotermopsis, which is the first of these families I wanted to talk about, which is Archotermopsidae. Archotermopsidae, these are the rotten wood termites. There are 3 species of a single genus in the US, and there are 12 extant species and 3 genera total worldwide. Many of the known termites in this group are extinct, and we only know them from the fossil record. The alates, which are the winged termites, don't have ocelli or a fontanelle. So one of the things that some termites have is a structure on their head called a fontanelle. It is not always easy to see, but it's basically, it'll look kind of like a little, much smaller than this, but a little circle on their head, a little ball, or a little tube that sticks out of their head. And it is used by soldiers mostly for defensive purposes. It can excrete various defensive chemicals. So the Archotermopsidae don't have ocelli or fontanelles. Another thing to talk about, and this is something that a lot of people have trouble with the termites, is your ability to correctly identify them using a dichotomous key, or even your knowledge of them, is going to depend on the caste life stage that you find. Some of the keys will only work for some of the castes. So there are dichotomous identification keys that only work for workers, that only work for soldiers, that only work for adult females, that only work for adult male, by adult I mean reproductive females, or only work for reproductive males. And those keys may only work while they have their wings, because you need characteristics for their wings. And once those wings fall off, you can no longer identify them. So some of these traits will only be for certain life stages. So with the Archotermopsidae, when I say that they lack ocelli and a fontanelle, that is specifically talking about the winged stages. And with other stages, I'll try and specify what life stage I'm talking about, or what caste stage I'm talking about. Soldiers, as you can see here, possess very large flat heads with very large serrated downward-facing mandibles. So that is fairly easy to identify if you have a soldier. Sometimes with the workers, they're sometimes the hardest ones to identify depending on what species you're looking at. The Kalotermitidae, which is here, this is the next group. So the Kalotermitidae, we talked about this one, and now let's talk about the Kalotermitidae. The Kalotermitidae are one of the more common groups in the US. or US and Canada. There are 18 species in 8 genera in North America, and worldwide there are 450 species in 21 genera. These are the drywood or dampwood termites, so they tend to infest dry wood, as you would get from the name. They don't require contact with soil at all. So most termites have, even if they're infesting wood, they will be building their chambers underground. They will be in the soil. With the Kalotermitidae, they do not infest wood at all. It is not necessary they do not infest the ground at all. They only infest the wood. So you'll find these in old trees, you'll find these in houses, things like that. I will be coming back to them for identifying features once we talk about the Heterotermitidae next, but a lot of their features are found in this region right here, the head and the prothorax. With the Heterotermitidae, these are the subterranean termites. They are some of the most destructive termites in North America. These are also associated with some of the really invasive insects in North America. These used to be called the Rhinotermitidae, and they recently had their name changed. When I originally learned these, I learned these as the Rhinotermitidae. There are 9 species in 4 genera in the US. There are 320 species in 12 genera worldwide. They are the most widely distributed family worldwide, possibly because of how invasive they are. I'm not entirely sure, but they are very serious pests. These guys, unlike the Kalotermitidae, these were the Kalotermitidae, if you'll remember. These guys infest the ground directly, and then they will eat on wood that is in contact with the ground. So sometimes you'll have these living around your house in the ground, and they will get into the wooden structures of your house by burrowing underground into it. They build nests in the soil, and they don't care if the wood is dry or wet. They include some of the most destructive species in the US, like I said, including the extremely invasive Formosan subterranean termite, which is mostly invasive around the Gulf Coast and has done a ton of damage in Texas and Louisiana. And you have to treat your structures constantly because of these things. These guys, the Heterotermitidae, can largely be distinguished from the Kalotermitidae and the Archotermopsidae by the structure of their pronotum. The Heterotermitidae workers can be distinguished from the Kalotermitidae by the shape of their pronotum here. So if you see on these Heterotermitidae workers, the pronotum is kind of curved. It's crescent shaped. It tends to be pretty flat, and it is more narrow than the head. So if I get rid of those lines there, you can see that the head is wider than that pronotal segment. If we go to the Kalotermitidae, you'll see that it is kind of, it's not as curved, it's kind of straight, blocky, and it's about as wide as the head. So depending on the specimen, it's about as wide, the pronotum is about as wide as the head. So that is one way to distinguish the workers between these two families. The Heterotermitidae can also be distinguished by their pronotum from the true Termitidae, which have much narrower, they have an extremely small, narrow pronotum. So the Heterotermitidae are kind of in the middle there. For the adults, like we talked about with the Archotermopsidae, the adults can be distinguished by the presence or absence of the ocelli and the fontanelle. So in the Kalotermitidae, they have a fontanelle in all cases. Although I will say, in my experience, the fontanelle can be very hard to see on the workers. You really have to have a very strong microscope, and it tends to be pretty small. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the Termitidae. We have very few of these in the US. They tend to be in the desert. And this is an example of the Nasuti termites. So in this particular group, they frequently have this enormous fontanelle, which is modified and called a Nasuti. This is not present in all of the Termitidae, but we do have Nasutotermes in the US, so I figured I'd talk about these. These are otherwise a minor family in the US. There's 11 species in 5 genera. Most of them are relegated to the more tropical or dry areas. But worldwide, this is the largest family. You just won't see them much in North America, North Mexico. Worldwide, there's almost 2,000 species in 250 genera, so it's a lot of termites. But again, they're more in the jungles and things like that. These guys don't necessarily feed on wood directly. They are big foragers. A lot of them feed on grass or plant litter, or some of them feed on animal dung. But in the case of the Nasutotermes, they have this. This is a Nasuti that it's a fontanelle that's been modified, and it's used as a weapon in the soldier casts, and it secretes a number of defensive chemicals. So that's, if you see something like this Nasuti, where it has this enormous projection on the front of the head, you know that you're dealing with one of the Termitidae, specifically the Nasuti termites. So that's pretty neat. But overall, I'm not a huge fan of the termites. I find them fairly hard to identify when they're in front of me because of how specific the keys are for the different casts. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on these, and this is really all I'm going to say about the termites in this case. Next time, we're going to move on to the Mentodea, which are, I think, a much more interesting group, although probably not as complicated as the roaches and the termites. But until then, please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.